My fingernails dug crescents into my palms as Thomas Whitmore's voice cut through the country club dining room, like a blade through silk. Street garbage in a borrowed dress, he announced to his friends, all 23 pairs of eyes watching as I carefully folded the linen napkin beside my untouched plate of roasted duck. The crystal chandelier above cast dancing shadows across the mahogany table, but nothing could diminish the burning humiliation flooding my cheeks. The smirk on Thomas's face was worth memorizing, that self-satisfied expression of a man who thought he'd won. But Thomas didn't know that sitting in my briefcase was evidence of his billion-dollar merger fraud. The silence stretched like a taut wire before Thomas continued his assault, his bourbon-soaked voice carrying across the private dining room of the Beacon Hill Country Club. "I hired a private investigator, you know," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Fascinating what you discover about people who try to climb above their station." My stomach dropped as 23 faces turned toward me with renewed interest. These weren't just any dinner guests. These were Boston's elite power brokers, old money families whose names graced hospital wings and university buildings. The Cabot matriarch leaned forward in her pearls, while Judge Hartford adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses for a better view of the spectacle. "Kylie here grew up in a lovely little trailer park in Dayton, Ohio." Thomas announced his words dripping with mock sympathy. "Her father ran a construction company into the ground bankruptcy, liens the whole 9 yards, left the family with nothing but debt and broken dreams." Heat flooded my face as murmurs rippled around the table. I caught Mrs. Pemberton whispering to her husband behind her jeweled hand, while the Ashworth twins pulled out their phones to discreetly record the social assassination unfolding before them. "But our Kylie here is resourceful," Thomas continued, relishing every word. "Worked 3 jobs through community college gas station, attendant, diner, waitress, and house cleaner. Can you imagine those hands that scrub toilets now trying to hold champagne flutes at charity galas?" My boyfriend Marcus sat frozen beside me, his face pale but his mouth firmly shut. Not once did he move to defend me or tell his father to stop. His silence cut deeper than any of Thomas's words. "She managed to transfer to Boston University on need-based aid," Thomas pressed on. "Full scholarship for underprivileged students. Quite the climb from Trailer Park to Beacon Hill, wouldn't you say?" Patricia Whitmore, Thomas's wife, finally spoke up from across the table. "Thomas, dear, perhaps we could—" "Oh, I'm not finished," he interrupted, holding up his hand. "The best part is how she thinks she belongs here now. Designer dress, probably rented for the occasion, trying to fit in with her betters." His laugh was cold and calculating. "Some people simply don't understand that breeding matters. You can dress up street garbage, but it's still garbage underneath." The room fell silent except for the gentle clink of someone setting down their water glass. I realized this wasn't spontaneous cruelty fueled by alcohol. This was a calculated, premeditated attack designed to humiliate me so thoroughly that I would disappear from Marcus's life forever. Thomas had orchestrated this entire dinner as a public execution of my character, using Boston's social elite as his willing audience. Dr. Williams from Massachusetts General shifted uncomfortably in his chair while the Beckworth sisters exchanged meaningful glances. These people would spread this story through every drawing room and yacht club from Back Bay to Martha's Vineyard before the weekend ended. As Thomas lifted his bourbon in a mock toast, his eyes gleaming with triumph, I made a decision that would change everything. I wouldn't run. I wouldn't cry. I would remember every word, every face, every detail of this moment, because someday, somehow, I would make sure Thomas Whitmore understood exactly what kind of mistake he'd just made. My chair scraped against the polished hardwood floor as I stood ignoring the collective intake of breath from the dinner guests. "Excuse me." I managed my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to freshen up." Walking through the country club's ornate hallways felt like moving underwater. Oil paintings of long-dead Brahmins stared down from gilded frames, their disapproving expressions mirroring the faces I'd left behind in the dining room. My heels clicked against marble floors that probably cost more than my father's annual income before his business collapsed. The ladies' powder room was empty, thank God. I gripped the marble vanity and stared at my reflection in the antique mirror. The woman looking back at me wore a navy blue cocktail dress I'd saved for months to afford, not rented as Thomas had suggested. My dark hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon that had taken me an hour to perfect. But all I could see now was what Thomas saw an imposter playing dress-up in a world where I didn't belong. I splashed cold water on my wrists, trying to calm the rage burning in my chest. The bathroom door opened with its characteristic squeak, and I quickly ducked into one of the private stalls, not ready to face whoever had entered. "Gregory, you worry too much," came Thomas's unmistakable voice from the hallway outside. "The environmental assessments are clean as a whistle." My blood froze. Gregory Harrison was Thomas's business partner, a nervous man with thinning hair who'd barely spoken during dinner. I pressed myself against the stall door, straining to hear their conversation through the powder room's open window. Those reports were supposed to be confidential. Gregory's voice carried a tremor of anxiety. "If anyone discovers what we've done with the soil contamination data, nobody's going to discover anything." Thomas interrupted with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "The Meridian Industries acquisition goes through next week exactly as planned. $300 million in inflated value thanks to our creative interpretation of those pesky environmental concerns." My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone, quickly activating the voice recorder. This was securities fraud on a massive scale, the kind of white-collar crime that destroyed retirement funds and pension plans. But the groundwater contamination alone should trigger a $200 million cleanup requirement, Gregory protested. "We're talking about heavy metals, industrial solvents, God knows what else from decades of improper disposal. If the EPA gets involved..." "The EPA won't get involved because they'll never see the real assessment reports," Thomas said with chilling matter-of-factness. "Our friends at Environmental Solutions, Inc. have provided us with beautifully sanitized documents that show minimal impact. Meanwhile, the actual contamination data sits safely in my private safe, where it will remain until long after we've closed this deal." I felt sick to my stomach. Meridian Industries was a manufacturing company with facilities across 3 states. Thousands of investors, including pension funds representing teachers, firefighters, and police officers, were planning to sink their retirement savings into what they believed was a clean, profitable acquisition. The pension funds alone represent over 400,000 individual investors. Gregory continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "If this deal collapses when the real environmental costs surface, then they should have done better due diligence." Thomas cut him off coldly. "I'm not running a charity here, Gregory. We're businessmen. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions." "Difficult decisions." Gregory's voice cracked. "Thomas, we're talking about people's life savings. Retirement funds for public employees who've worked 30 years believing their pensions were safe. If they lose everything because we hid contamination that makes Meridian worthless, they'll lose their money whether we're involved or not." Thomas replied with frightening calm. "At least this way we profit from the inevitable. The contamination has been there for decades. We didn't create it. We're simply choosing not to advertise it." My phone captured every word as Thomas laid out his strategy to defraud investors while enriching himself. But as I listened to him describe the pension fund victims, a terrible realization began to form. I thought about my father's construction company, how it had failed so suddenly after acquiring what seemed like prime commercial property, how the cleanup costs had bankrupted him when unexpected contamination surfaced months after the purchase. "Besides," Thomas added with a chuckle that made my skin crawl, "it's not like we haven't done this before. Remember the Ohio project in 2008? Same playbook, same results. That contractor who bought the contaminated land never knew what hit him." Ohio, 2008, the year my father lost everything. I remained hidden in the powder room stall long after Thomas and Gregory's footsteps faded down the hallway. My mind raced as I tried to process what I'd just heard. The implications were staggering, not just for the Meridian deal, but for countless other victims of Thomas's systematic fraud over the years. When I finally returned to the dining room, most of the guests had moved to the club's library for brandy and cigars. Marcus sat alone at the table, scrolling through his phone, with the casual indifference of someone who hadn't just watched his father destroy his girlfriend's dignity in public. "We need to talk," I said quietly, sliding back into my chair. He didn't look up from his screen. "About what?" "About what your father just did to me. About why you sat there saying nothing while he humiliated me in front of every important person in Boston." Marcus finally raised his eyes, and what I saw there chilled me more than his father's cruelty. There was no guilt, no remorse, no love, just cold calculation. "Maybe he has a point," Marcus said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Maybe you don't really belong in our world." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Our world, Marcus. We've been together for 18 months. You said you loved me. You talked about marriage, about building a life together. I said a lot of things." He set down his phone and looked at me directly for the first time since his father's attack. "But let's be honest, Kylie. You're a nice girl, but you're not exactly wife material for someone in my position." "Your position?" I struggled to keep my voice level. "What position is that exactly?" "I'm a Whitmore. My family has been in Boston society for 6 generations. My great-grandfather founded Whitmore Industries. My father sits on the boards of 3 major banks and 2 Fortune 500 companies. I can't just marry anyone I want." "So what was this? What were we?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Marcus had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Look, you're smart, you're beautiful, and you're great in bed. We had fun. But fun doesn't translate into marriage, and you were naive if you thought otherwise." I stared at him, searching for any trace of the man I thought I'd known. The man who'd brought me soup when I was sick, who'd spent hours listening to me talk about my dreams of working in finance, who'd held me while I cried about missing my father. "There's something else." Marcus continued his tone, becoming almost businesslike. "My father asked me to keep track of certain things about your work, projects you were involved in, clients you mentioned, that sort of thing." My blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about?" "You work for Davidson and Associates. They handle a lot of deals that could potentially compete with Whitmore Industries. My father wanted to know if any conflicts of interest might arise." "You were spying on me." The betrayal felt like a knife twisting in my chest. "I was protecting family interests," Marcus corrected. "You talked about your work all the time. The Henderson acquisition, the coastal capital, restructuring the pension fund, diversification projects. I simply passed along relevant information." I thought about all the intimate conversations we'd shared, all the times I'd confided in him about challenging projects at work, all the details I'd shared about client strategies and deal structures, information that could be worth millions to a competitor. "The Meridian deal," I said suddenly. "You told him about the Meridian deal." Marcus's pause was all the confirmation I needed. "That was business, Kylie. Nothing personal." Nothing personal. I stood up so quickly, my chair nearly toppled over. "You used me. For 18 months, you used me to steal confidential information from my firm." "I wouldn't call it stealing," Marcus said calmly. "You volunteered the information freely. I just happened to find it useful." The casual cruelty in his voice was almost worse than his father's public humiliation. At least Thomas's attack had been openly hostile. Marcus's betrayal was surgical, precise, and utterly without remorse. "Did you ever care about me at all?" I asked, hating how vulnerable the question made me sound. Marcus considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "You were convenient. And like I said, we had fun. But let's not pretend this was some great love story, Kylie. People like you and people like me, we inhabit different worlds. Tonight was just a reminder of that reality." He stood up and straightened his jacket, preparing to join the other guests in the library. "My advice: accept that this was never going to work out, take the lesson my father offered tonight, and find someone more suited to your background. There are plenty of middle-class guys who would be thrilled to have you." As Marcus walked away, leaving me alone at the table, surrounded by the remnants of a dinner I'd never finished, I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was determination. Both Whitmore men had underestimated me tonight. They'd shown me exactly who they were, and now I would show them exactly who I was. The recording on my phone contained evidence of securities fraud that could bring down Thomas's empire, and now I knew that Marcus had been feeding him insider information about my firm's deals, including potentially our work on competing bids for the very same Meridian Industries that Thomas was planning to acquire through fraud. Thomas wanted to play games with people's lives and fortunes. Marcus wanted to use and discard people like they were disposable. They were about to learn that some garbage burns empires down. My apartment in Cambridge felt like a sanctuary after the toxic atmosphere of the country club. I kicked off my heels and immediately went to my laptop, the recording from my phone already uploaded and saved in 3 different locations. The Whitmore men might have money and connections, but I had something they didn't evidence of their crimes. I brewed a pot of coffee and settled in for what I knew would be a long night of research. The name Meridian Industries had been familiar when I first heard it, and now I needed to figure out why. My firm's client database required several security clearances to access from home, but as a senior analyst, I had the necessary permissions. As I scrolled through active projects, my heart began to pound. There it was, Meridian Industries acquisition file number M2024-473. The lead advisor listed was Sarah Davidson, my boss, and the founding partner of Davidson & Associates. The acquiring entity was Coastal Capital Group, one of our most important institutional clients. I opened the project files and felt my blood pressure spike as I read the details. For the past 4 months, our firm had been working around the clock to structure a legitimate bid for Meridian Industries. Sarah had assembled a team of environmental lawyers, forensic accountants, and industrial specialists to conduct the most thorough due diligence possible. Every contamination report, every environmental impact study, every regulatory filing had been scrutinized to determine Meridian's true value. According to our analysis, Meridian was worth approximately $420 million, assuming proper environmental cleanup and regulatory compliance. Our bid reflected this realistic valuation, accounting for estimated remediation costs of nearly $200 million based on preliminary soil and groundwater testing. But Thomas's fraudulent bid, if Gregory's numbers were accurate, valued Meridian at over $700 million by completely ignoring the environmental liabilities. Not only was this securities fraud, but it would also guarantee that Thomas's bid would be accepted over our legitimate offer. I pulled up the project timeline and felt sick. The Meridian board was scheduled to make their final decision on competing bids in exactly 5 days. Thomas wasn't just committing fraud, he was using insider information from Marcus to outmaneuver my firm's honest work. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Team meeting tomorrow at 7 a.m. Meridian decision expected sooner than anticipated. Need all hands on deck. I stared at the message, realizing the impossible position I was now in. If I revealed what I knew about Thomas's fraud, I'd have to explain how I obtained the information, which could expose the fact that Marcus had been feeding confidential details about our bid strategy to a competitor for months. That kind of security breach could not only end my career, but potentially expose Davidson & Associates to lawsuits from other clients who might question whether their confidential information had been compromised. But if I stayed silent, thousands of innocent investors would lose their life savings when Thomas's artificially inflated deal inevitably collapsed under the weight of massive environmental cleanup costs. I opened a new browser window and began researching Thomas Whitmore's business history, looking for patterns that might help me understand the full scope of his operations. What I found made me feel physically ill. Whitmore Industries had been involved in at least 12 major acquisitions over the past 15 years, and every single one followed a similar pattern. Thomas would acquire properties or companies with hidden environmental problems, conceal the contamination through falsified reports, then resell at inflated prices to unsuspecting buyers. When the environmental costs eventually surfaced, the buyers faced financial ruin, while Thomas profited from insurance settlements and tax write-offs on the failed investments. The Ohio project Gregory had mentioned, I found it buried in a trade publication article from 2009. Whitmore Industries had sold contaminated commercial property in Dayton to a local construction company that went bankrupt within 18 months when EPA testing revealed soil contamination, requiring $23 million in cleanup costs. My father's construction company had been based in Dayton. The timeline matched perfectly. With shaking hands, I searched for more details about the Ohio transaction. The construction company that had purchased the contaminated property was called Morrison Building Solutions. The owner was listed as David Morrison. David Morrison, my father. Thomas Whitmore hadn't just humiliated me tonight, he had destroyed my family 15 years ago. The failed business venture that had driven my father to bankruptcy, that had forced us into the trailer park that had crushed my father's spirit and ultimately contributed to his early death from stress-related heart problems, had been one of Thomas's deliberate fraud schemes. I was no longer just a witness to securities fraud. I was the daughter of one of Thomas's victims, and I finally understood why Marcus had been so interested in my background when we first met. Thomas must have realized who I was from the beginning, the daughter of David Morrison, the construction company owner he destroyed in Ohio. This had never been about romance or even corporate espionage. This had been about Thomas keeping his enemies close, monitoring the daughter of a man whose life he'd ruined to make sure she never posed a threat to his empire. But now I posed the biggest threat he'd ever faced. Because unlike my father, I had the financial expertise to understand Thomas's methods, the legal knowledge to document his crimes, and most importantly, the evidence to prove everything. Thomas and Marcus thought they'd won tonight. They had no idea that their greatest victory was about to become their ultimate downfall. The next morning, I called in sick to work something I'd never done without actually being ill. But I needed time to dig deeper into Thomas's criminal empire before confronting him with evidence that could destroy everything he'd built. I drove to the Boston Public Library's research division knowing that accessing certain databases from home might leave digital footprints that could be traced back to me. The librarian, a kind woman named Helen with silver hair and reading glasses, helped me access historical business records, SEC filings, and environmental reports that weren't available online. For 8 hours, I methodically traced Thomas's business dealings across 2 decades. The pattern was even more extensive than I'd initially realized. Whitmore Industries operated like a sophisticated criminal organization using shell companies, offshore accounts, and corrupt environmental consulting firms to systematically defraud investors while poisoning communities. The Morrison Building Solutions transaction was just one of 27 documented cases where Thomas had sold contaminated properties to unsuspecting buyers. The environmental consulting firm that had provided the falsified clean reports for my father's property, Environmental Solutions, Inc., was the same company Gregory had mentioned in connection with the Meridian deal. But as I dug deeper into the company's records, I discovered something that made my hands shake with rage. Environmental Solutions, Inc. wasn't just Thomas's partner in fraud, it was owned by him. He'd created an entire fake environmental consulting company solely to produce fraudulent reports that would hide contamination from his victims. The scope of the devastation was staggering. Teachers in Detroit had lost their pensions when a Whitmore-sold property collapsed under cleanup costs. A small town in Vermont had seen its main employer go bankrupt when soil contamination made their facility unusable. Retirement communities in Florida had lost millions when supposedly pristine land turned out to be former chemical dump sites. Each victim followed the same pattern my father had experienced: initial excitement about acquiring valuable property, followed by the gradual discovery of environmental problems, then financial ruin as cleanup costs spiraled beyond their ability to pay. Meanwhile, Thomas collected insurance payouts, tax benefits, and often bought back the contaminated properties at bankruptcy auctions for pennies on the dollar. But the most horrifying discovery came when I found a folder of internal Environmental Solutions Inc. documents that had been leaked during a whistleblower lawsuit in 2018. The case had been settled out of court with strict confidentiality agreements, but the initial court filings were still public record. Among the leaked documents was an email from Thomas to the head of Environmental Solutions Inc., with the subject line, "Morrison Project, Final Cleanup." The email, dated 3 months after my father's bankruptcy, contained a single chilling line: "Target eliminated. Property acquisition proceeding as planned." Target eliminated. My father wasn't just collateral damage in Thomas's fraud scheme, he had been specifically targeted for destruction. Thomas had researched my father's construction business, identified it as a potential threat to his land acquisition plans in the Dayton area, and deliberately sold him contaminated property to eliminate the competition. The medical examiner's report listed my father's cause of death as myocardial infarction, a heart attack brought on by severe stress and financial pressure. But now I knew the truth. Thomas Whitmore had murdered my father as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger. The stress of losing everything, of facing lawsuits he couldn't afford to fight, of watching his life's work crumble because of hidden contamination, that stress had killed him. I printed every document, photographed every screen, and saved every file. By the time I left the library, I had assembled a case that could send Thomas to prison for decades. But as I drove home through Boston's evening traffic, I realized I'd also discovered something else that changed everything. Among the Environmental Solutions Inc. documents was a list of upcoming projects properties that Thomas planned to sell using falsified environmental reports. The Meridian Industries site was on that list, but it wasn't the only one. There were 6 other major deals planned over the next 18 months, representing over $2 billion in fraudulent transactions that would devastate pension funds, retirement accounts, and municipal investments across the country. The Meridian deal wasn't just one crime, it was the first domino in a series of fraudulent schemes that would destroy thousands of families' financial security. If I could stop Thomas now, I wouldn't just be avenging my father's death. I'd be preventing countless future victims from experiencing the same devastation my family had endured. But I also realized that I couldn't do this alone. Thomas had too much money, too many connections, and too much political influence for a single person to challenge successfully. I needed allies, people with their own reasons to want to see Thomas Whitmore brought to justice. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I noticed a black sedan with tinted windows parked across the street. The same car had been behind me when I left the library. Thomas might be arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. If he suspected I was investigating him, he would take steps to protect himself. I was running out of time to build a case against him. But more importantly, I was running out of time to save the thousands of innocent people whose retirement funds would be destroyed when Thomas's Meridian fraud inevitably collapsed. The war between us had begun the moment he called me garbage at that dinner table. But now I understood that this wasn't just about personal revenge, it was about justice for every family Thomas had destroyed, starting with my own. Sunday morning brought an unexpected phone call that changed everything. I was reviewing my research files when my phone rang, displaying an unknown Boston area code. Is this Kylie Morrison? The voice was female, nervous, and vaguely familiar. Yes, who is this? This is Patricia Whitmore. We need to talk. I nearly dropped the phone. Mrs. Whitmore, I don't think... Please, she interrupted. I know what my husband said to you Friday night was inexcusable, but there are things you need to know about Thomas that go far beyond dinner party cruelty. Can you meet me somewhere private? An hour later, I sat across from Patricia in a small coffee shop in Brookline, far from the social circles where she might be recognized. Without her designer gown and jewelry, she looked older, more fragile, and utterly exhausted. I've been married to Thomas for 25 years. She began her hands wrapped around a coffee cup for warmth despite the mild weather. When I married him, I thought he was an honorable businessman who'd built his fortune through hard work and intelligence. What changed? I asked carefully. Patricia's laugh was bitter. Nothing changed. I just gradually discovered who he really was. The first hint came about 5 years into our marriage when I found documents in his home office environmental reports that had been altered. When I asked him about them, he told me I was misunderstanding technical language. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. But I'm not stupid, Kylie. I have a master's degree in environmental science from MIT. I know what soil contamination reports look like, and I know when they've been falsified. My heart began to race. You've been documenting his crimes. For 15 years, Patricia confirmed. Every forged document I could copy, every suspicious conversation I could record, every meeting with corrupt officials I could photograph. I've been building a case against my own husband because I couldn't live with the knowledge of what he was doing to innocent people. She slid the envelope across the table. But I never had the financial expertise to understand the full scope of his operations. I knew he was committing fraud, but I didn't understand the securities law violations, the pension fund implications, the systematic nature of his schemes. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were hundreds of photographs of documents, USB drives containing audio recordings and detailed notes spanning years of Thomas's criminal activities. This wasn't just evidence, it was a complete roadmap of his entire fraudulent empire. Why didn't you go to the authorities? I asked. Patricia's expression darkened. Because Thomas isn't just a businessman, he's a predator who protects himself by destroying anyone who threatens him. Our prenuptial agreement leaves me with nothing if I divorce him. No money, no property, no security. And he's made it clear that if I ever betrayed him, he would ensure I faced criminal charges as an accomplice. But you weren't an accomplice. You were documenting evidence. Try explaining that to a jury when Thomas's lawyers present forged documents showing that I helped plan his schemes. He's created fake email accounts in my name, falsified financial records showing payments to me from his shell companies, even manufactured evidence that I was the one who contacted Environmental Solutions, Inc. about falsifying reports. The sophistication of Thomas's protection scheme was breathtaking. He hadn't just committed crimes, he'd built an entire system to frame his own wife if she ever tried to expose him. So why are you coming to me now? I asked. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. Because Friday night, when I watched him destroy you in front of all those people, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. You remind me of myself 25 years ago, intelligent, ambitious, believing that good people could build honest lives. Thomas crushed that idealism in me, but he hasn't crushed it in you yet. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. And because I know who your father was, David Morrison. Thomas didn't just sell him contaminated land, Kylie. He targeted your father specifically because Morrison Building Solutions was planning to bid on the same municipal contracts Thomas wanted. Your father's death wasn't collateral damage, it was murder by financial warfare. The coffee shop seemed to spin around me. You knew all this time, you knew Thomas killed my father. I found the targeting documents in his files 3 years after it happened. By then, the statute of limitations had passed for most of the charges, and I had no way to contact you without exposing myself. But I've been waiting for an opportunity to make things right. Patricia reached across the table and grasped my hand. I can't bring your father back, Kylie, but I can help you make sure Thomas never destroys another family. The evidence in that envelope includes everything you need to prove the Meridian fraud, plus documentation of 23 other schemes spanning 15 years, including the Morrison Building Solutions transaction. Every document, every email, every forged report that led to your father's bankruptcy, plus the insurance fraud Thomas committed afterwards when he bought back the contaminated property and claimed environmental remediation costs he never actually paid. I stared at the envelope, understanding that it contained not just evidence of crimes, but proof of my father's murder and the systematic destruction of countless innocent families. "There's something else," Patricia continued. "Thomas doesn't know about your investigation yet, but he's suspicious. Marcus told him about your relationship ending, and Thomas is paranoid enough to assume you might cause problems. He's planning to have you fired from Davidson and Associates by claiming you leaked confidential information to competitors. He can't prove that because it isn't true." Patricia's smile was grim. "Thomas doesn't need proof, Kylie. He manufactures it, just like he manufactured evidence against me as insurance. Right now, his people are creating fake email accounts, falsified transaction records, and forged communications that will make it appear you've been selling insider information for months." The trap was already being set. Thomas wasn't just protecting himself from my potential investigation, he was actively working to destroy my credibility before I could expose his crimes. "How much time do I have?" I asked. "The Meridian board meets Wednesday to finalize the acquisition. Thomas plans to have you discredited by Tuesday, ensuring that any accusations you make will be dismissed as the desperate lies of a disgraced former employee." I looked at the evidence Patricia had gathered, understanding that it represented my only chance to stop Thomas before he destroyed both my career and the financial security of thousands of innocent investors. "Will you testify?" I asked. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "If you can guarantee my protection from Thomas's retaliation, yes. But Kylie, you need to understand what you're up against. Thomas has judges in his pocket, politicians on his payroll, and enough money to make evidence disappear. This won't be easy." "Nothing about fighting monsters ever is," I replied, thinking of my father's gentle hands and the stress lines that had appeared on his face during those final months. "But some fights are worth having regardless of the cost." As we left the coffee shop, Patricia handed me a final envelope. "One more thing," she said. "Thomas isn't working alone on the Meridian deal. His business partner, Gregory Harrison, is being blackmailed into cooperation. If you can find a way to approach Gregory safely, you might find another ally in this fight." I drove home with evidence that could bring down a criminal empire, but also with the knowledge that I was now in a race against time. Thomas was already moving to destroy my credibility, and I had less than 72 hours to build a case strong enough to survive his counterattack. The war had escalated beyond personal revenge. This was now about justice for every family Thomas had destroyed, protection for every future victim, and ensuring that my father's death would finally have meaning. Some garbage burns empires down. Thomas was about to learn exactly how hot that fire could burn. Monday morning arrived with the kind of autumn crispness that usually filled me with optimism. Instead, I felt like I was walking into a minefield as I entered the offices of Davidson and Associates. The evidence Patricia had given me was safely stored in a bank security deposit box, but I knew Thomas's counterattack was already in motion. My assistant Jennifer looked unusually nervous when I arrived. "Kylie, Sarah wants to see you in her office immediately." She seemed upset. Sarah Davidson was a formidable woman who'd built her firm through intelligence, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to ethical business practices. At 62, she was one of the most respected financial advisors in Boston, known for her meticulous attention to detail and her refusal to compromise her principles for profit. "Close the door," she said as I entered her corner office overlooking the harbor. Her expression was grimmer than I'd ever seen it. "Sarah, if this is about taking Friday off—" "It's not about Friday," she interrupted, turning her computer monitor toward me. "It's about this." On the screen was an email thread that made my blood run cold. The messages appeared to be from my corporate email address sent to an account labeled kmorrison.consulting@eggmail.com. The emails contained detailed information about Davidson and Associates' client strategies, including confidential details about the Meridian Industries bid. "That's not my email address," I said immediately. "I don't have a consulting business, and I've never sent confidential client information to anyone." The IT department confirmed these emails originated from your workstation, Sarah replied coldly. The metadata shows they were sent during regular business hours over the past 3 months. The consulting account has received payments totaling $47,000 from accounts linked to foreign investment firms. I stared at the screen in horror. The emails were perfectly crafted to look like insider trading communications, complete with details only someone with access to our client files could know. But the writing style was subtly different from mine, and the information was arranged in ways that suggested someone was reconstructing conversations rather than reporting them firsthand. Sarah, this is fabricated. Someone is trying to frame me. The evidence suggests otherwise. Sarah opened another folder on her computer. These are bank records showing deposits into an account linked to that consulting email address. The deposits correspond exactly with the dates of major client announcements that would have been valuable to competitors. What account? I've never opened any consulting account. The account was opened 3 months ago with your social security number and driver's license information. The signature on the banking documents matches your employment records. Thomas's reach was even more sophisticated than I'd imagined. He hadn't just forged emails, he'd created an entire false financial trail, complete with bank account signatures and transaction records that would be almost impossible to disprove without extensive forensic analysis. This is identity theft and fraud, I said desperately. Someone has stolen my personal information to create false evidence against me. Sarah's expression softened slightly. Kylie, I've known you for 3 years. This doesn't match your character or your work ethic, but the evidence is overwhelming and we have a fiduciary responsibility to our clients. If you've been leaking confidential information, it could expose the firm to massive liability claims. Who brought this to your attention? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We received an anonymous tip Friday evening, someone claiming to be a concerned party who discovered evidence of insider trading. The information was too detailed and too well documented to ignore. Friday evening, hours after Thomas's dinner party attack, he'd already begun implementing his plan to destroy my professional reputation. Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said, sitting forward in my chair. I'm being framed by someone with extensive resources and criminal connections. The Meridian Industries deal we're working on involves securities fraud at the highest levels, and I've stumbled onto evidence that could expose $1 billion criminal enterprise. That's a very serious accusation, Kylie. I have documentation proving that the competing bid for Meridian is based on falsified environmental reports designed to hide massive contamination costs. The fraud involves forged government assessments, bribery of regulatory officials, and systematic deception of pension fund investors. Sarah studied my face carefully. Do you have proof of these allegations? Yes, but if I'm fired for alleged insider trading, any evidence I present will be dismissed as the desperate fabrication of a disgraced employee. That's exactly why this frame-up was designed to happen before Wednesday's board meeting. The Meridian board meeting. Sarah's eyebrows rose. How did you know that was moved up to Wednesday? That information was confidential. I realized I'd made a mistake. The meeting change wasn't public information. I only knew about it from Patricia's warning, which I couldn't reveal without exposing her cooperation. I struggled to find a plausible explanation that wouldn't implicate Patricia or reveal the extent of my investigation. Sarah's expression hardened again. This is exactly what concerns me, Kylie. You seem to have access to confidential information about timeline changes that were only communicated to senior partners. It suggests you may have sources inside competing firms, or sources inside the companies involved in the acquisition. I said carefully, Sarah, what if I could prove that the environmental assessments in the competing Meridian bid are fraudulent? What if I could show you evidence that the other bidders are committing securities fraud on a massive scale? I'd say you were trying to distract from your own ethical violations by making unsubstantiated accusations against competitors. The trap was perfectly constructed. Thomas had anticipated that I might try to expose his crimes and had created a framework where any accusations I made would appear to be desperate lies from a caught criminal. My credibility was already destroyed in Sarah's eyes. "I'm suspending you pending a full investigation," Sarah announced. "Security will escort you out of the building and your access to all firm resources is immediately revoked. If the investigation confirms insider trading, we'll terminate your employment and refer the matter to federal authorities." "Sarah, please. Give me 48 hours to prove my innocence. Let me show you evidence of the real crimes being committed here." "Evidence you claim to have obtained through legitimate means despite being framed by a criminal enterprise." Sarah's tone was skeptical. "Kylie, do you understand how that sounds?" As security arrived to escort me from the building, I realized Thomas had achieved multiple objectives with a single move. He destroyed my professional credibility, eliminated my access to competing bid information, and created a narrative where any evidence I presented would be viewed as fabricated revenge against the people who'd exposed my alleged crimes. But Thomas had made one critical error in his planning. He'd assumed that destroying my career would be enough to silence me. He didn't understand that I was no longer fighting for my job. I was fighting for justice for my father and protection for thousands of innocent investors. The frame-up had succeeded in discrediting me professionally, but it had also freed me from any obligation to protect Davidson and Associates from the collateral damage of exposing Thomas's crimes. I no longer had to worry about confidentiality agreements or professional ethics constraints. Thomas wanted to play dirty. He was about to discover that he'd just unleashed an opponent with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Tuesday morning found me sitting in a downtown Boston diner, staring at a cup of coffee that had grown cold while I tried to figure out my next move. With my professional credibility destroyed and my access to resources eliminated, I felt like David facing Goliath without even a slingshot. That's when Gregory Harrison walked through the diner's front door. He looked terrible, unshaven, rumpled suit, the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights filled with guilt and fear. He scanned the dining area nervously before his eyes found mine. For a moment I thought he might flee, but instead he approached my corner booth with the hesitant steps of a man walking to his execution. "May I sit down?" he asked quietly. I nodded, curious about what Thomas's business partner could possibly want with me. Gregory slid into the opposite seat and immediately began speaking in a rushed whisper. "I know what happened to you at Davidson and Associates. Thomas told me about the frame-up about how he destroyed your career to prevent you from interfering with the Meridian deal." "And you're here to gloat?" I asked bitterly. "I'm here to help you stop him," Gregory said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Because I can't live with what we've done anymore, and you're the only person with the knowledge and motivation to bring Thomas down." I studied his face, looking for signs of deception. "Why would you betray your business partner?" Gregory's hands shook as he reached for his coffee. "Because Thomas isn't my partner, he's my blackmailer. And because I finally realized that helping him commit crimes makes me just as responsible for destroying innocent people's lives." "What do you mean, blackmailer?" 5 years ago, my daughter Emma was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She was 12 years old. The treatment costs were astronomical experimental therapies, specialized medications, round-the-clock nursing care. My insurance covered some of it, but we were looking at over $400,000 in out-of-pocket expenses. Gregory's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I embezzled money from our firm's client accounts to pay for Emma's treatment. Just borrowing it, I told myself. I'd pay it back once she recovered and I could focus on work again. Thomas discovered the embezzlement. He discovered it, covered it up, and used it to control me ever since. Every time I tried to refuse participation in his schemes, he'd remind me that one phone call to the FBI would destroy not only my career, but Emma's medical care. She's in remission now, but still needs ongoing treatment that costs thousands of dollars each month." The elegant trap became clear. Thomas had allowed Gregory to steal money specifically to create leverage over him. It was the same pattern I'd seen in Patricia's situation. Thomas protected himself by ensuring his accomplices had more to lose than he did. But Emma's treatment will continue even if I go to prison, Gregory interrupted. I finally accepted that. My daughter is alive because I committed crimes, but other people's children are suffering because I helped Thomas destroy their parents' financial security. I can't live with that anymore. Gregory reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. These are the original environmental impact reports for Meridian Industries, the real ones before Thomas had them altered. The contamination is even worse than you probably realize. I opened the folder and felt my stomach drop. The genuine reports showed contamination levels that would require nearly $300 million in cleanup costs, not the $200 million I'd estimated. The affected area included residential neighborhoods and 3 schools built on land contaminated by decades of illegal chemical disposal. This isn't just financial fraud, I said, reading through the technical assessments. This is a public health emergency. Children are attending schools built on contaminated ground. It gets worse, Gregory continued. The contamination includes heavy metals and organic compounds that cause developmental delays and cancer. Thomas knows this, but he's planning to complete the sale before anyone discovers the health risks. Why are you telling me this? Why not go directly to the authorities? Gregory's expression was grim. Because I tried. Last month, I contacted the SEC's Boston office to report the securities fraud. 3 days later, the investigating agent called Thomas directly to discuss my allegations. Thomas has people everywhere: regulators, prosecutors, judges. Any official complaint gets back to him before it reaches anyone who might actually investigate. So how do we stop him? You still have credibility with one group of people who can't be bought, Gregory said. The media. Investigative journalists who specialize in financial crimes. If we can get irrefutable evidence to the right reporters, Thomas won't be able to suppress the story through political connections. I thought about this approach. The evidence would have to be absolutely bulletproof. After the frame-up at Davidson and Associates, any journalist will be skeptical of my motives. That's why we need Patricia, Gregory said. She has 15 years of documentation and she's never been accused of any crimes. Her testimony would corroborate everything we've discovered. You know about Patricia's cooperation. I've suspected for years that she was documenting Thomas's activities. She's too intelligent and too moral to be genuinely ignorant of his crimes. But I never approached her because I was afraid Thomas would realize she was a threat. A plan began forming in my mind. What if we could create a situation where Thomas exposed himself publicly, where he confessed to his crimes in front of witnesses who couldn't be bought or intimidated? How would we manage that? I smiled grimly, thinking about the country club dinner where this all began. By giving Thomas exactly what he wants: the opportunity to humiliate his enemies in front of an audience. His arrogance is his weakness. If we can create the right circumstances, he'll incriminate himself because he won't be able to resist bragging about his victories. Gregory considered this. The Meridian closing dinner is tomorrow night. Thomas is hosting a celebration at the Beacon Hill Country Club for all the major investors and political figures involved in the deal. He's planning to announce the successful acquisition and take credit for structuring the most profitable environmental acquisition in Massachusetts history. Perfect, I said. Thomas's greatest triumph will become his confession. But we'll need more than Patricia's documentation and your testimony. We'll need real-time evidence of him admitting to the crimes. What do you have in mind? Something that will ensure Thomas's own words destroy his empire. I replied, thinking of the recording device I'd used to capture his conversation with Gregory, and something that will finally give my father justice. As we left the diner, I realized that Thomas's greatest mistake hadn't been underestimating me. It had been creating so many victims that eventually some of them would find each other and fight back together. Tomorrow night at the same country club where he'd called me garbage, Thomas Whitmore would learn the true meaning of that phrase. Some garbage burns empires down, and his empire was about to go up in flames. That evening, I met Patricia and Gregory at a law office in Cambridge, far from the downtown legal district where Thomas might have informants. The attorney Rachel Chen specialized in whistleblower protection and financial crimes. More importantly, she had no connections to Boston's old money establishment and no reason to protect Thomas's interests. "What you're describing is a RICO case," Rachel said after reviewing the evidence we'd assembled. "Racketeering, conspiracy, securities, fraud, environmental crimes, and potentially murder charges if we can prove the connection between the environmental fraud and your father's death." "Can we build a case strong enough to guarantee conviction?" I asked. "The evidence is extensive, but there's a problem," Rachel admitted. "Thomas has been smart about compartmentalizing his operations. The forged documents come from shell companies. The bribery payments are routed through offshore accounts, and most of the direct communications are between Thomas and people who are either dead or too compromised to testify." "What about the Meridian deal?" Gregory asked. "That's happening in real time. We can document the fraud as it occurs." "That's our best opportunity," Rachel agreed. "But we need more than just evidence of this single crime. We need Thomas to admit to the broader conspiracy to reveal the scope of his operations in a way that can't be dismissed as isolated incidents." Patricia leaned forward. "I've been thinking about that. Thomas has one weakness that we haven't fully exploited: his need to be recognized as the smartest person in the room. He can't resist explaining his strategies when he thinks he's won." "The closing dinner tomorrow night," I said, understanding her direction. "If we can get him talking about his methods in front of the right audience—" "It won't just be any audience," Patricia continued. "Thomas has invited federal regulators, state environmental officials, and pension fund managers to celebrate the Meridian acquisition. If he confesses to fraud in front of those people, they'll have a legal obligation to report it." Rachel nodded slowly. "That could work, but only if we can record the confession and ensure it's admissible in court. Any evidence obtained through illegal surveillance would be inadmissible." "What if the recording devices were placed by someone with legitimate access to the venue?" I asked. "That would depend on the specific circumstances," Rachel replied carefully. "If a participant in the conversation consents to recording, it's generally legal in Massachusetts." I thought about the country club's layout, remembering the private dining room where Thomas had humiliated me. "Patricia, as Thomas's wife, you'd have legitimate access to the venue ahead of time, right?" "Yes, I'm hosting the dinner with him. I have complete access to set up decorations, arrange seating coordinate with the catering staff." "And Gregory, you're attending as Thomas's business partner." "Unfortunately, yes. He wants me there to answer technical questions about the environmental assessments if any of the regulators get curious." A plan crystallized in my mind. What if we could create a situation where Thomas feels compelled to defend his methods, where he's so confident in his victory that he explains exactly how he's been committing fraud for years? "How?" Rachel asked. "By putting him in a room with his victims," I said. "People he thinks he's destroyed who suddenly reappear to challenge him. His arrogance won't let him walk away from that confrontation." Patricia's eyes widened with understanding. "You're planning to attend the dinner?" "Not attend," I corrected. "Crash. Thomas will have security to keep out uninvited guests, but he won't be able to resist the opportunity to humiliate me again in front of federal officials, especially if I arrive with accusations he thinks he can easily discredit." "That's incredibly dangerous," Gregory protested. "Thomas has already destroyed your career. If you confront him publicly without irrefutable proof, he could have you arrested for trespassing harassment or worse." "He could," I agreed, "but he won't. Because Thomas's greatest weakness is his ego. He'll want to defeat me publicly to demonstrate his power over someone who dared to challenge him. And when he does, he'll reveal more than he intends." Rachel looked concerned. "This plan requires Thomas to incriminate himself voluntarily. That's a significant gamble." "It's not a gamble if we understand his psychology." Patricia said thoughtfully. Thomas genuinely believes he's superior to everyone around him. When he feels threatened, he doesn't retreat. He attacks by demonstrating his intellectual dominance. If Kylie challenges him with partial accusations, he'll respond by explaining why she's wrong, and in doing so, he'll reveal the full scope of his crimes. "What if he just has me thrown out?" I asked. "He won't," Patricia said with certainty, "because that would look like weakness in front of the federal officials. Thomas will want to crush you intellectually, not physically remove you. He'll see it as the perfect opportunity to demonstrate his power while discrediting any future accusations you might make." Gregory nodded slowly. "And if we're recording the conversation, we'll capture his confession, along with the audience's reaction. Federal regulators won't be able to ignore evidence they witness personally." "There's still the question of recording equipment," Rachel noted. "Any devices would need to be completely undetectable and positioned to capture clear audio of the entire conversation." "I can handle that," Patricia said. "Thomas has been so paranoid about business competitors that he's had the private dining room debugged for surveillance equipment multiple times. I know exactly where monitoring devices can and can't be placed without detection. And I can ensure the conversation happens in the right location," Gregory added. "I'll guide the discussion toward the environmental assessments, creating openings for Kylie to challenge Thomas's explanations." As we refined the plan, I felt the familiar mixture of terror and determination that had sustained me through the past week. Tomorrow night, I would walk back into the same room where Thomas had called me garbage. But this time, I would be armed with evidence of his crimes and a strategy to make him destroy himself. "There's one more thing," I said as we prepared to leave. "We need to ensure the pension fund managers and federal officials understand the full scope of what they're witnessing. They need to know that the Meridian fraud isn't an isolated incident, but part of a 15-year pattern of crimes." "How do we accomplish that?" Rachel asked. "By making sure they have copies of all the evidence before the dinner begins," I replied. "Anonymous packages delivered to their offices tomorrow afternoon containing documentation of Thomas's previous fraudulent schemes. When he confesses tomorrow night, they'll realize they're not just witnessing a single crime, but the culmination of a massive criminal enterprise." Patricia smiled grimly. "Thomas wanted to celebrate his greatest victory tomorrow night. Instead, he'll be confessing to his greatest defeat." As we left the law office, I understood that we were past the point of no return. Tomorrow night would either bring justice for my father and protection for thousands of future victims, or it would complete Thomas's destruction of everyone who dared to oppose him. But for the first time since that humiliating dinner, I felt genuinely hopeful. Thomas had built his empire by isolating and destroying his victims one at a time. Tomorrow night he would face all of his victims together, united by a shared determination to ensure that his reign of financial terror finally ended. Some garbage burns empires down. Tomorrow night, Thomas Whitmore would learn exactly how hot that fire could burn. Wednesday morning arrived with gray skies that matched my mood as I prepared for what could be either my vindication or my final destruction. I'd barely slept, running through every possible scenario of how the evening might unfold. Thomas was clever, ruthless, and had decades of experience destroying people who threatened him. One mistake on my part could end with me in federal custody while he celebrated his latest victory. My phone rang at 7 a.m., unknown number. "Hello, Kylie Morrison." The voice was official clipped. "This is Agent Daniel Rodriguez, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We need you to come in for questioning immediately regarding allegations of securities fraud and corporate espionage." My blood turned to ice. "I'm sorry, what allegations?" "We've received evidence that you've been selling confidential client information to foreign competitors and engaging in insider trading related to the Meridian Industries acquisition. There's a federal warrant for your arrest." Thomas had escalated beyond professional destruction. He was using his political connections to have me arrested before tonight's confrontation. "Agent Rodriguez, I think there's been a misunderstanding." I can explain. Ma'am, you need to understand the seriousness of these charges. Wire fraud violation of the Economic Espionage Act conspiracy to defraud investors. You're looking at 20 years in federal prison if convicted. 20 years. For crimes I'd never committed based on evidence Thomas had manufactured. Can I at least call my attorney? You can call your attorney from federal custody. We're en route to your location now. I hung up and immediately called Rachel Chen. They're coming to arrest me. Thomas has convinced the FBI that I'm the criminal. Don't say anything without me present, Rachel said immediately. I'll meet you at the federal building. This is exactly what we anticipated Thomas using law enforcement as a weapon to silence his opponents. Through my apartment window, I could see black SUVs pulling into the parking lot. Federal agents in tactical gear were already surrounding the building. Thomas hadn't just called in a favor, he'd convinced the FBI that I was a dangerous criminal requiring a full tactical response. The knock on my door was polite but firm. FBI, please open the door, Ms. Morrison. I opened the door to find Agent Rodriguez, a middle-aged man with steel gray hair and tired eyes, flanked by 4 other agents. Kylie Morrison, you're under arrest for wire fraud conspiracy and violations of federal securities laws. You have the right to remain silent. As the handcuffs clicked around my wrists, I thought about my father's face during those final months before his death. The stress lines, the sleepless nights, the gradual realization that he was trapped in a system designed to destroy him. Now I understood exactly how he'd felt. The federal building's holding cells were clean but cold, filled with the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look guilty. I sat on a metal bench for 3 hours before Rachel arrived with a legal pad and a grim expression. The charges are extensive, she said, sliding documents through the cell's slot. Wire fraud, computer crimes, violation of the Economic Espionage Act conspiracy to defraud investors. But here's the interesting part. The evidence against you is almost too perfect. What do you mean? The digital forensics show that the incriminating emails were sent from your workstation, but the metadata indicates they were composed using software you don't have installed on your computer. The bank records show deposits into an account opened with your social security number, but the signature analysis reveals subtle differences that suggest forgery. Can we prove it's fabricated? With time, yes. But that's exactly what Thomas is counting on, keeping you in custody until after the Meridian deal closes. By the time we can prove your innocence, the fraud will be complete and thousands of investors will have lost their retirement savings. I slumped against the cold concrete wall. So he wins. After everything we've discovered, after all the evidence we've gathered, Thomas still manages to silence me at the crucial moment. Not necessarily, Rachel said, lowering her voice. The FBI agents who arrested you aren't corrupt. They're following what appears to be legitimate evidence. Agent Rodriguez specifically mentioned that they received the tip about your alleged crimes from a concerned party with extensive documentation. Thomas. Almost certainly. But here's what's interesting. The concerned party also provided information about irregularities in the Meridian Industries environmental assessments. The FBI is planning to investigate those claims after they finish processing your case. I sat up straighter. They have copies of the real environmental reports. Someone anonymously delivered comprehensive documentation of environmental fraud to the FBI's Boston office yesterday afternoon. The same documentation that Patricia has been gathering for 15 years. Patricia. She'd anticipated Thomas's move and countered by ensuring the FBI received evidence of his crimes, even if I was silenced. So they know about the Meridian fraud. They know something is suspicious, but they won't act on it immediately because they need to verify the authenticity of the anonymous evidence. That process could take weeks. The Meridian deal closes tomorrow. Exactly. Which is why Thomas timed your arrest perfectly. By the time the FBI confirms that the environmental assessments are fraudulent, the acquisition will be complete and the pension fund money will be gone. I felt the walls of the cell closing in around me. Thomas had anticipated every move we'd made and countered with a strategy that used the legal system itself as a weapon against his victims. "There is one option," Rachel said carefully, "but it's extremely risky and could result in additional charges against you." "What option?" "The FBI is required to investigate credible threats to public safety immediately regardless of ongoing criminal cases. If they received evidence that the Meridian contamination posed an immediate health risk to children, specifically the 3 schools built on contaminated land, they'd be obligated to halt the acquisition pending emergency environmental testing." "How would we get them that evidence?" "Someone would need to deliver the health impact assessments directly to Agent Rodriguez, along with documentation showing that Thomas knew about the risks to children and chose to hide them to complete the fraudulent sale." I understood what she was suggesting. "You want me to confess to having evidence of crimes in order to report bigger crimes. I want you to fulfill your civic duty to report threats to public safety. The fact that you'd be admitting to investigative activities that could violate your bail conditions is unfortunate, but secondary to protecting children from contamination exposure." It was a desperate gamble. Admitting to possessing evidence could support Thomas's claims that I'd been conducting corporate espionage, but staying silent would guarantee that hundreds of children continued attending schools built on toxic waste, while their parents' pension funds were stolen to cover up the contamination. "Get me the health assessments," I said. "If the FBI won't listen to my accusations against Thomas, maybe they'll listen to my concerns about poisoned children." Rachel smiled grimly. "I'll contact Patricia immediately. She has medical documentation showing the connection between the contamination and childhood developmental disorders in similar cases." As Rachel left to gather the evidence, I realized that Thomas's greatest tactical error had been arresting me in a federal building filled with agents who'd sworn oaths to protect public safety. He'd assumed that framing me for financial crimes would silence any accusations I might make about his environmental fraud. But he'd forgotten that even accused criminals have the right to report threats to public safety. And unlike financial fraud, which could be explained away through legal technicalities, the prospect of poisoned children would demand immediate action from any honest law enforcement officer. Thomas wanted to use the FBI as his personal weapon. He was about to discover that weapons can be turned against their wielders. Agent Rodriguez was about to receive evidence that would force him to choose between protecting Thomas's business interests and protecting innocent children from toxic contamination. Some garbage burns empires down, and sometimes the very system designed to silence the garbage becomes the torch that lights the fire. 3 hours after Rachel left, Agent Rodriguez returned to my cell with a thick folder and an expression I couldn't read. Behind him walked a woman I didn't recognize, mid-40s professional suit, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested federal authority at a higher level than local financial crimes. Ms. Morrison. Agent Rodriguez said, "This is Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. She needs to speak with you about some information that's come to light regarding your case." Agent Chen sat across from me in the small interview room, spreading photographs and documents across the metal table. "Ms. Morrison, we've received some interesting information about your alleged criminal activities. Information that suggests you may not be the primary subject we should be investigating." My heart began to pound, but I kept my expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Your attorney delivered documentation showing that the Meridian Industries' environmental assessments contain falsified data that conceals contamination, threatening the health of approximately 800 children attending schools built on affected land." Agent Chen's voice was steady, but I could detect underlying anger. "These documents suggest that someone with extensive resources and political connections has been systematically defrauding investors while endangering public health." "I don't know anything about that," I said, carefully remembering Rachel's instructions to avoid admitting to investigative activities that could support the espionage charges. Agent Chen opened another folder. We've also discovered something interesting about the anonymous tip that led to your arrest. The person who reported your alleged insider trading also provided evidence of environmental fraud involving the same Meridian acquisition. That person appears to have extensive knowledge of both your supposed crimes and the environmental cover-up. Isn't it possible that someone discovered both types of criminal activity independently? It's possible, Agent Chen agreed, but unlikely, especially when our preliminary investigation suggests that the evidence against you may have been fabricated by the same party who's committing the environmental fraud. She slid a photograph across the table, a bank document showing the account supposedly opened in my name. Our forensic accounting specialists noticed something interesting about this signature. It's almost identical to yours, but there are subtle differences suggesting it was traced or copied rather than written naturally. What does that mean for my case? It means you're being framed, Agent Rodriguez said bluntly. The question is by whom and why? Agent Chen leaned forward. Ms. Morrison, we've been investigating corruption in Massachusetts environmental regulation for 8 months. We have evidence of systematic bribery, falsified government reports, and conspiracy involving state officials and private corporations. What we haven't had is proof connecting these crimes to specific individuals or companies. I maintained my careful neutrality, but inside I was stunned. The FBI had been investigating Thomas independently, building a case that intersected with everything Patricia had documented. Your arrest yesterday was supposed to be routine processing of a financial crimes case, Agent Rodriguez continued. But when we received evidence about environmental fraud involving the same acquisition that appeared in your alleged insider trading, we realized we might be looking at something much bigger. The health risks alone require immediate action, Agent Chen added. 800 children are potentially being exposed to carcinogenic chemicals and heavy metals. We can't wait for the legal process to run its course when children's lives are at stake. What kind of immediate action? I asked. We're obtaining emergency injunctions to halt the Meridian acquisition pending comprehensive environmental testing. We're also seizing all documents related to Environmental Solutions, Inc., or the consulting firm that provided the allegedly falsified assessments. Environmental Solutions, Inc., Thomas's fake consulting company. The FBI was dismantling his operation piece by piece. There's something else, Agent Chen said, opening a final folder. We've identified the source of the anonymous tip that led to your arrest. The information came from someone with access to sophisticated document fabrication resources and detailed knowledge of federal investigative procedures. She showed me a communication log that made my pulse race. The anonymous tip had come from Thomas Whitmore himself, using a series of shell companies and intermediaries to hide his identity while providing the FBI with manufactured evidence against me. Mr. Whitmore appears to have extensive connections within state environmental regulatory agencies, Agent Rodriguez noted. Connections that may explain how fraudulent environmental assessments received official approval despite obvious discrepancies. Are you saying Thomas Whitmore framed me to prevent me from exposing his environmental fraud? I asked, finally allowing myself to hope that the truth was emerging. We're saying that the evidence strongly suggests a pattern of criminal behavior that extends far beyond simple financial fraud, Agent Chen replied. Environmental crimes, bribery of public officials, conspiracy, and potentially murder, if we can prove that environmental contamination was deliberately concealed from victims who died from stress-related health problems caused by financial ruin. Murder. They were talking about my father. The individual who provided the anonymous environmental documentation appears to have been collecting evidence for many years. Agent Rodriguez continued. Evidence of systematic fraud involving dozens of contaminated properties sold to unsuspecting buyers across multiple states. Patricia. They were describing Patricia's 15 years of documentation without revealing her identity. Ms. Morrison. Agent Chen said, "We're prepared to drop all charges against you in exchange for your cooperation in our investigation of this environmental fraud conspiracy. But we need to know, Do you have any information that could help us identify the parties responsible for these crimes? I looked at both agents, understanding that this was the moment when everything would be decided. I could continue maintaining my innocence and hope the fabricated evidence against me would eventually be disproven. Or I could trust that these federal agents were genuinely committed to justice and tell them everything I discovered. "I need to speak with my attorney," I said finally. "Of course," Agent Chen agreed. "But Ms. Morrison, I want you to understand something. Thomas Whitmore isn't just committing financial fraud, he's poisoning children and destroying families. If you have information that could stop him, those children's health may depend on your decision." As the agents left me alone in the interview room, I realized that Thomas's greatest mistake had been using the FBI to frame me. He'd assumed that federal agents were as corrupt as the state officials he'd been bribing for years. Instead, he'd delivered evidence of his own crimes directly to honest investigators who were already building a case against him. The hunter had become the hunted. Thomas thought he was using law enforcement as a weapon against me, but he'd actually armed his enemies with the tools they needed to destroy his empire. Patricia had been working with the FBI for months, not just documenting Thomas's crimes, but actively cooperating with a federal investigation. My arrest wasn't a defeat. It was the final piece of evidence the FBI needed to prove that Thomas was systematically eliminating threats to his criminal enterprise. When Rachel returned, I would tell her everything, not because I trusted the system, but because I finally understood that the system included people like Agent Chen and Agent Rodriguez federal officers who cared more about protecting children than protecting corrupt businessmen with political connections. Thomas had wanted to silence me by framing me for his crimes. Instead, he'd given me federal protection and a platform to expose the full scope of his criminal empire. Some garbage burns empires down, and Thomas had just handed me the matches. Agent Chen returned that afternoon with news that changed everything we thought we knew about the Meridian Industries contamination. She carried classified folders marked with Department of Homeland Security seals, and her expression was grimmer than I'd seen from any federal agent. "Ms. Morrison, we need to discuss the true nature of the contamination at the Meridian site." She began setting the folders on the interview room table. "What we've discovered goes far beyond industrial pollution or even environmental fraud. We're dealing with a national security issue." "National security?" I asked, confused. Agent Rodriguez joined us, closing the door behind him. "Our environmental specialists have analyzed soil samples from the Meridian property. The contamination includes chemical compounds that were never used in commercial manufacturing. These are substances that were only produced during classified military research programs in the 1980s. My stomach dropped. "What kind of military research?" "Chemical weapons testing," Agent Chen said quietly. "Specifically experimental nerve agents and biological weapons that were developed in violation of international treaties. The Meridian site was used as a testing ground for weapons that were supposed to have been destroyed decades ago. The implications hit me like a physical blow. The children attending those schools are being exposed to some of the most toxic substances ever created," Agent Rodriguez confirmed. "Compounds that cause neurological damage, developmental disorders, and aggressive forms of cancer. The health risks are exponentially worse than we initially realized." "How long has Thomas known about this?" I asked. Agent Chen opened one of the classified folders. "According to documents we've recovered, Thomas discovered the military contamination 3 years ago when he first acquired the property. Instead of reporting it to federal authorities as required by law, he covered it up and began planning to sell it to unsuspecting buyers." "But covering up military contamination, that's not just environmental fraud. That's terrorism," Agent Rodriguez said bluntly. "Under federal law, deliberately concealing weapons-grade chemical hazards that threaten public safety constitutes an act of domestic terrorism. Thomas Whitmore isn't just a financial criminal. He's a terrorist who's been poisoning American children to protect his profits." The scope of Thomas's evil was beyond anything I'd imagined. "What about the other properties? The other victims, like my father, were conducting emergency testing at 17 sites connected to Environmental Solutions, Inc. Agent Chen replied, "Preliminary results suggest that at least 6 properties contain similar military-grade contamination. Your father's construction site in Ohio is one of them. Weapons-grade contamination. My father hadn't just been destroyed by financial fraud, he'd been killed by exposure to chemical weapons that Thomas had deliberately hidden from him. The Department of Homeland Security is treating this as an active terrorism investigation," Agent Rodriguez continued. "We're coordinating with the EPA, the CDC, and military chemical weapons specialists to assess the full scope of the threat." "What about tonight's celebration dinner?" I asked. "Thomas is planning to announce the successful Meridian acquisition to federal regulators and pension fund managers." Agent Chen's expression hardened. "That dinner is now part of a federal terrorism investigation. We'll be placing the entire venue under surveillance and recording every conversation that occurs. You're going to arrest Thomas tonight. We're going to let him confess to terrorism charges in front of multiple federal witnesses," Agent Rodriguez corrected. His arrogance makes him want to explain his victories. Tonight he'll explain how he's been concealing weapons-grade contamination while defrauding pension funds representing 400,000 public employees. My original plan to confront Thomas at the dinner had become unnecessary. The FBI was now conducting its own operation to gather evidence of his crimes with resources and legal authority that I could never have accessed. Ms. Morrison. Agent Chen said, "We're offering you complete immunity from all charges in exchange for your continued cooperation. But we need you to understand that what you've uncovered isn't just corporate fraud. It's one of the largest domestic terrorism cases in recent history. What do you need me to do?" "Nothing," Agent Rodriguez said. "You've already done more than enough by helping us identify the scope of Thomas's criminal enterprise. Tonight, federal agents will be recording his confession to terrorism charges. Your role in this investigation is complete." As I sat in that federal interview room, I realized that my quest for justice had revealed something far more horrifying than financial fraud. Thomas Whitmore hadn't just stolen money from pension funds, he'd been deliberately exposing American children to chemical weapons for years, causing developmental disabilities and cancers while covering up the source of their suffering. The 800 children attending schools on contaminated land weren't just victims of environmental neglect. They were casualties of domestic terrorism conducted by a man who valued profits more than human life. My father's death, the destruction of countless families, the systematic theft of retirement funds, all of it had been committed by a domestic terrorist who'd been operating with impunity for decades. But tonight, Thomas's reign of terror would end. Not because of my investigation or Patricia's documentation, but because he'd finally committed crimes so heinous that even his political connections couldn't protect him. The FBI hadn't just uncovered securities fraud, they'd identified an active terrorism threat that required immediate federal intervention. Thomas would be arrested not as a white-collar criminal, but as an enemy of the United States who'd been poisoning American children with chemical weapons. Some garbage burns empires down, but sometimes the garbage is so toxic that it requires a federal hazmat team to contain the fire. The Beacon Hill Country Club looked exactly as I remembered from that humiliating dinner a week earlier, but tonight federal agents filled the shadows between the historic buildings. Agent Chen had arranged for me to observe the operation from a surveillance van parked discreetly across the street, giving me a front-row seat to Thomas Whitmore's final performance. Through high-powered audio equipment, I could hear the conversations in the private dining room, where Thomas was celebrating what he believed to be his greatest triumph. The guest list read like a directory of Boston's power elite pension fund managers, environmental regulators, federal officials, and political figures who controlled billions in public investments. The Meridian acquisition represents a new model for environmental stewardship. Thomas's voice came through the speakers clearly. He was in full performance mode, basking in the attention of his audience. Through innovative assessment techniques, we've identified opportunities that others might have overlooked. Patricia's voice was barely audible as she played her role as the dutiful wife, but I could detect the tension in her words. Thomas has always been so thorough in his environmental analysis. He never overlooks important details. Indeed, came the voice of Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the Massachusetts Environmental Protection Director. Your Environmental Solutions, Inc. provided the most comprehensive contamination assessments we've ever reviewed. The site is remarkably clean for a property with Meridian's industrial history. In the surveillance van, Agent Rodriguez shook his head. Dr. Warren has no idea she's been approving falsified documents for years. When she learns that her signature authorized the sale of weapons-contaminated property to pension funds, her cooperation will be guaranteed. Gregory's nervous voice joined the conversation. The environmental clearances were certainly thorough. Perhaps too thorough, some might say. Nonsense. Thomas responded with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. Environmental due diligence is like any other aspect of business you pay for expertise, and expertise delivers results. Environmental Solutions, Inc. has been providing those results for 15 years. Agent Chen leaned forward in her chair. He's starting to brag about the scope of his operations. Give him a few more minutes and he'll confess to everything. The conversation in the dining room continued as Thomas held court explaining his philosophy of creative environmental management to an audience that included the very federal officials who would soon be arresting him. His arrogance was breathtaking. He was literally confessing to environmental terrorism in front of EPA regulators and FBI agents who were attending the dinner in their official capacities. That's when the unexpected happened. The dining room doors opened and Marcus Whitmore entered the celebration. Father. Marcus's voice carried clearly through the surveillance equipment. I think we need to discuss some concerns that have come to light about the Meridian environmental assessments. Thomas's tone sharpened immediately. What concerns the assessments were thoroughly reviewed and approved by all relevant authorities. I've been contacted by someone claiming to have evidence that the Environmental Solutions, Inc. reports were falsified, Marcus continued. Someone who seems to have detailed knowledge of our business practices. The surveillance van fell silent as we realized what was happening. Marcus wasn't there to support his father. He was confronting him publicly about the environmental fraud. Who contacted you? Thomas demanded. A former employee of Davidson and Associates who claims you've been systematically defrauding investors through falsified environmental reports. Someone named Kylie Morrison. My blood turned to ice. Marcus was using my name to provoke his father, but he had no idea that federal agents were recording every word of the conversation. Thomas's laugh was cold and sharp. Kylie Morrison is currently in federal custody for securities fraud and corporate espionage. Any accusations she might make are the desperate fabrications of a caught criminal. But what if her accusations are true? Marcus pressed. What if Environmental Solutions, Inc. has been providing falsified reports? What if the Meridian contamination is worse than disclosed? Marcus. Thomas's voice carried a warning edge, but his arrogance wouldn't let him stop explaining. Environmental Solutions, Inc. provides exactly the environmental assessments our clients need. If those assessments differ from what government regulators might find using more primitive testing methods that simply reflects our superior analytical capabilities. Agent Rodriguez smiled grimly. He's confessing to fraud in front of 3 federal regulators and 2 pension fund directors. This is better than we hoped. But Thomas wasn't finished. His need to demonstrate intellectual superiority was overwhelming his survival instincts. The truth is, Thomas continued, environmental regulation in this country is far too restrictive. Former military testing sites like Meridian contain trace amounts of substances that pose minimal risk to public health. But bureaucratic overcaution would require unnecessarily expensive cleanup procedures that make profitable development impossible. Former military testing sites. He just admitted knowing about the weapons contamination in front of an audience that included federal officials with security clearances. Military testing sites. Dr. Warren's voice carried sharp surprise. Thomas the Meridian assessments made no mention of military contamination. That information would have triggered mandatory federal review, because mandatory federal review would have prevented a perfectly safe and profitable development, Thomas replied dismissively. Sometimes environmental stewardship requires making informed decisions rather than following bureaucratic protocols designed by people who don't understand the realities of modern business. Agent Chen was already speaking into her radio. All units move now. We have confession to knowing concealment of weapons contamination. Through the audio feed, I could hear the dining room doors opening as federal agents entered the celebration. Thomas's voice rose in confusion and anger as he realized what was happening. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Agent Rodriguez's voice came clearly through the speakers as he entered the dining room. "Thomas Whitmore, you're under arrest for domestic terrorism conspiracy and violation of federal weapons control statutes. You have the right to remain silent." The celebration had become a crime scene. Pension fund managers and environmental regulators who'd attended as guests were now federal witnesses to terrorism charges. Thomas's moment of ultimate triumph had become his public confession to crimes that would send him to federal prison for the rest of his life. In the surveillance van, I watched through night vision cameras as Thomas was led from the country club in handcuffs, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. The same dining room where he'd called me garbage a week earlier had become the stage for his final defeat. Patricia emerged from the club shortly after walking with the calm dignity of a woman whose 25-year nightmare was finally ending. She looked directly at our surveillance van and nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement between allies who'd fought the same war from different fronts. Marcus followed, his face pale with the realization that his father was a domestic terrorist and that his own trust fund was built on the suffering of poisoned children. His privileged world was collapsing, just as mine had a week earlier. But unlike me, he discovered that his family fortune came from weapons contamination and systematic murder. As federal agents secured the scene, Agent Chen turned to me. "Ms. Morrison Thomas Whitmore will be held without bail pending terrorism charges. Environmental Solutions, Inc. is being seized as a criminal enterprise, and all properties associated with their assessments are being tested for weapons contamination." What about the other victims? The families like mine who lost everything to his fraud? Victim compensation will be handled through the Federal Terrorism Victim Assistance Program, Agent Rodriguez replied. The amounts will be substantially higher than typical white-collar crime restitution because of the terrorism classification. I thought about my father, about the stress lines on his face during those final months, about the heart attack that had killed him, when the contamination costs destroyed his business. Thomas Whitmore had finally been held accountable, not just for fraud, but for the domestic terrorism that had murdered my father and countless other victims. The war was over. Thomas's empire had burned to the ground, consumed by the very arrogance that had built it. Some garbage burns empires down, and tonight justice had finally been served. 2 days after Thomas's arrest, I sat in Agent Chen's office reviewing the full scope of the investigation that had grown far beyond anything I'd initially imagined. The terrorism charges had triggered a federal task force involving the FBI, Homeland Security, the EPA, and military chemical weapons specialists. What they'd discovered was a criminal enterprise that had operated for over 2 decades. Environmental Solutions, Inc. was involved in covering up weapons contamination at 37 sites across 12 states. Agent Chen explained, spreading maps across her desk. The estimated cleanup costs exceed $4 billion, and the health impacts affect over 12,000 people who were unknowingly exposed to chemical weapons residue. 12,000 people. I repeated, struggling to comprehend the scale of Thomas's crimes. "Including your father," Agent Rodriguez added. The Ohio site where Morrison Building Solutions was located contained nerve agent precursors that caused the neurological problems your father experienced during his final months. His heart attack wasn't just stress-related, it was triggered by chemical poisoning that Thomas deliberately concealed. The medical examiner would need to amend my father's death certificate, but knowing the truth brought a kind of closure I hadn't expected. David Morrison hadn't died from business failure, he'd been murdered by a domestic terrorist who'd poisoned him with chemical weapons. What about the other people involved in Thomas's operation? I asked. Gregory Harrison received immunity in exchange for his testimony and cooperation in identifying additional contaminated sites. Agent Chen replied, "His daughter's medical treatment will be covered by the Federal Victim Assistance Program, and he'll be placed in witness protection pending Thomas's trial." And Marcus? Agent Rodriguez's expression darkened. Marcus Whitmore is facing federal charges for corporate espionage and conspiracy. His cooperation in provoking his father's confession will be considered during sentencing, but he actively participated in industrial espionage for years. He won't receive immunity. I felt a complex mixture of emotions about Marcus's fate. His betrayal had been personal and devastating, but his actions at the dinner had helped expose his father's terrorism. What kind of sentence is he facing? Probably 3 to 5 years in federal prison plus lifetime prohibition from working in financial services, Agent Chen said. His trust fund and inheritance are being seized as proceeds of criminal enterprise, so he'll be starting over from nothing when he's released. The poetic justice wasn't lost on me. Marcus had used and discarded me because he thought I didn't belong in his privileged world. Now he would discover what it felt like to lose everything and start over with nothing, the same experience he'd inflicted on me and countless other victims of his family's crimes. "There's something else you should know," Agent Rodriguez continued. "Marcus has been asking to speak with you. He claims he wants to apologize and explain his actions." "I'm not interested," I said immediately. Whatever explanations Marcus thinks he has, they won't change what he did or undo the damage he caused. "That's your choice," Agent Chen agreed. But he did provide information that helped us identify additional victims of his father's schemes. His cooperation may help us recover assets for victim compensation. A week later, Sarah Davidson called to offer me my job back at Davidson & Associates, along with a promotion to senior partner and leadership of the firm's new corporate accountability division. The fabricated evidence against me had been completely discredited, and my role in exposing one of the largest domestic terrorism cases in recent history had transformed me from suspected criminal to celebrated whistleblower. "I understand if you need time to consider the offer," Sarah said during our meeting at her office. "After everything you've been through, you might prefer a fresh start somewhere else." "Actually, I'd like to accept immediately," I replied. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "I want complete authority to investigate corporate environmental fraud with dedicated resources for forensic accounting and environmental testing. And I want the firm to establish a pro bono program, providing legal services to families affected by corporate contamination." Sarah smiled. "Done. When can you start?" That afternoon, I received a call from Patricia Whitmore, who was finalizing her divorce and preparing to testify at Thomas's terrorism trial. "I wanted you to know that I'm using the divorce settlement to establish a foundation for families affected by environmental contamination," she said. "We're calling it the David Morrison Foundation after your father." I had to stop walking to absorb what she'd said. "Patricia, I don't know what to say." "Your father was the first victim I knew about by name," she continued. "When I found those targeting documents in Thomas's files, I promised myself that someday I would make sure David Morrison's death had meaning. The foundation will provide legal assistance, medical care, and financial support for families whose lives have been destroyed by corporate environmental crimes." 6 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse as Judge Patricia Martinez sentenced Thomas Whitmore to life in prison without the possibility of parole. the terrorism charges combined with RICO violations and multiple counts of murder. The stress-related deaths of contamination victims had resulted in the maximum possible sentence under federal law. Thomas sat silently as the judge read his sentence, his arrogance finally replaced by the reality of spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. He would never again attend country club dinners or humiliate people he considered beneath him. He would never again profit from other people's suffering. But the most satisfying moment came when Judge Martinez addressed the impact statements from Thomas's victims. Families from across the country had come to Boston to describe how Thomas's crimes had affected their lives. The children born with developmental disabilities, the parents who died from contamination-related cancers, the communities whose drinking water had been poisoned by his cover-ups. I read my father's impact statement last describing David Morrison as a gentle man who'd built an honest business and trusted in the goodness of other people. A man who'd been targeted for destruction because his integrity threatened a criminal empire built on deception and environmental terrorism. Thomas Whitmore didn't just steal my father's money, I concluded. He murdered my father with chemical weapons, then blamed my father for his own death. But today, David Morrison's memory will outlive Thomas Whitmore's empire. The foundation bearing my father's name will protect future families from the kind of environmental terrorism that destroyed ours. As Thomas was led away in shackles, he looked directly at me for the first time since that dinner at the country club. But instead of the smirk I remembered, his face showed only the hollow expression of a man who'd finally learned that some garbage burns empires down and empires built on poisoned ground burn hottest of all. 6 months after Thomas's sentencing, I stood in the conference room of Davidson and Associates looking out at Boston Harbor while preparing for what had become our weekly victim advocacy meeting. The Corporate Accountability Division had grown from just me to a team of 15 investigators, environmental specialists, and victim advocates. We'd helped recover over $200 million for families affected by corporate environmental crimes, and our work had led to federal charges against 12 other companies involved in contamination cover-ups. The David Morrison Foundation, funded by Patricia's divorce settlement and donations from grateful families, had become one of the most effective advocacy organizations in the country. We'd helped pass new federal legislation requiring real-time monitoring of contaminated sites, established medical screening programs for contamination victims, and created a database that helped investigators identify patterns of corporate environmental terrorism. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Chen. Meridian site cleanup ahead of schedule. Schools will reopen next month with full safety certification. Thought you'd want to know the 800 kids are finally safe. 800 children who would never know how close they'd come to lifelong disability because of Thomas's greed. Their safety was the real victory. In this case, not Thomas's imprisonment or my professional vindication, but the fact that those kids could attend school without breathing chemical weapons residue. Patricia knocked on my conference room door carrying a folder of new case files. Her transformation from trophy wife to victim advocate had been remarkable. Without Thomas's psychological abuse and constant threats, she'd rediscovered the environmental scientist she'd been before her marriage, brilliant, determined, and absolutely fearless when it came to protecting families from corporate contamination. We've got 17 new cases this week, she said, setting the files on my desk. 3 from Texas involving oil companies, 2 from Michigan involving auto manufacturers, and 12 from various states involving real estate developers. Word is spreading that we actually win these fights. Any involving weapons contamination. 2 possibles. The Texas sites have unusual chemical signatures that match classified military compounds, and one of the Michigan locations was a former government research facility. I've already contacted Agent Chen about federal review. The terrorism prosecution had opened doors that no private investigation could have accessed. Federal agencies that had once protected corporate secrets were now actively investigating environmental cover-ups, understanding that concealed contamination represented potential national security threats. There's something else, Patricia continued. Marcus has been released from federal prison after serving 18 months. He's been asking through his attorney if you'd be willing to meet with him. I looked up from the case files, surprised. Why now? Apparently, he's been working on victim restitution programs while in prison. His attorney says he's identified assets that could provide additional compensation for families affected by Thomas's crimes. He needs signatures from lead victims to access trust funds that were hidden in offshore accounts. The thought of seeing Marcus again brought back memories. I'd tried to suppress the betrayal, the humiliation, the realization that 18 months of my life had been based on lies. But if meeting with him could help other families recover money they needed for medical treatment or contamination cleanup, my personal feelings were irrelevant. Set up the meeting, I decided. But make it official witnesses' recordings, legal documentation. I'm not interested in personal reconciliation, but if he has information that helps victims, I'll work with him. 2 weeks later, I sat across from Marcus in a federal building conference room with attorneys for both sides, present and court reporters documenting every word. Prison had changed him. He'd lost the entitled arrogance that had once defined his personality, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. Kylie, he began, I know there's nothing I can say that will undo what I did to you. The betrayal, the espionage, the way I used your feelings to steal information from your firm. I spent 18 months in prison thinking about the person I used to be, and I'm ashamed of almost everything about my past life. I kept my expression neutral. If you have information that helps victim compensation, I'm listening. If you want absolution for your personal choices, you'll need to find that somewhere else. Marcus nodded, understanding the boundaries. My father hid assets in trust funds located in the Cayman Islands in Switzerland. The accounts contain approximately $600 million that should legally belong to victim compensation programs. I've been working with federal investigators to trace the money and identify legal mechanisms for recovery. What do you need from me? As the daughter of the first identified victim, you have legal standing to authorize asset recovery on behalf of all contamination victims. The offshore banks require victim family signatures before they'll cooperate with federal asset seizure orders. I reviewed the documents his attorney provided. The trust funds contained more money than I'd imagined, enough to provide comprehensive medical care for every family affected by Thomas's environmental terrorism, plus funding for long-term contamination cleanup at dozens of sites. There's one more thing, Marcus said quietly. I've been volunteering with environmental cleanup organizations since my release, not because I'm trying to rebuild my reputation, but because I needed to understand the real impact of what my family did to people like your father. And what did you learn? That privilege isn't just about having money or social connections. It's about having the power to destroy people without consequences, and I use that power against you in ways that I'm still learning to understand. Your father didn't just lose his business. Because of contamination, he lost his faith in the goodness of other people. That betrayal of trust is something I helped perpetuate. I studied Marcus's face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving motivation. What I saw instead was something I'd never seen from him before: genuine understanding of the harm he'd caused. I can't forgive you, I said finally. Not for the betrayal, not for the espionage, and especially not for how you used my feelings against me. But if signing these documents helps families get the medical care they need, I'll do it. As I signed the asset recovery authorization, I realized that justice sometimes comes in unexpected forms. Marcus would live with the consequences of his choices for the rest of his life, not just the prison sentence, but the knowledge that his privileged upbringing had turned him into someone who destroyed innocent people for profit. The $600 million in hidden assets would fund medical treatment, environmental cleanup, and legal assistance for thousands of families. Children born with developmental disabilities would receive specialized care. Communities with poisoned water supplies would get modern filtration systems. Families destroyed by contamination-related illnesses would have financial security during their recovery. 3 years after that humiliating dinner at the country club, I stood in my corner office at Davidson and Associates, looking out at a harbor that sparkled in the afternoon sun. The David Morrison Foundation had helped pass federal legislation that prevented future environmental terrorism. Our corporate accountability division had recovered over $1 billion for contamination victims. Most importantly, federal monitoring programs now protected children from exposure to concealed chemical weapons. My assistant knocked on the door. "Kylie, there's a call for you. A woman in California whose family was affected by contaminated land sold by a company called Pacific Environmental Solutions. She says the contamination patterns match what happened in the Whitmore cases. Another corporate environmental criminal, another family destroyed by greed and cover-ups. But this time, they'd called the right person. The David Morrison Foundation had built a network of investigators, advocates, and federal contacts who could move quickly to protect victims and expose perpetrators." "Transfer the call," I said, reaching for my notepad, "and start a new case file." As I picked up the phone to help another family fight for justice, I thought about my father's gentle hands and his belief in the goodness of other people. Thomas Whitmore had murdered that faith along with my father's life, but the foundation bearing his name would ensure that future families wouldn't face environmental terrorism alone. Some garbage burns empires down, but from those ashes, David Morrison's legacy had grown into a movement that protected innocent people from corporate environmental crimes. Thomas's greatest crime had become his ultimate defeat, and my father's memory had become a shield protecting thousands of other families. The woman in California was crying as she described her daughter's illness and her family's financial devastation. But she'd called the right number, and she would discover that David Morrison's daughter had spent 3 years building an army of advocates who never forgot that behind every contamination case was a family that deserved justice, protection, and hope for the future. That's what real strength looks like, not the power to destroy people, but the determination to protect them. And that's a lesson Thomas Whitmore would have plenty of time to contemplate during the rest of his life in federal prison. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone's cruelty actually made you stronger? When someone underestimated you so completely that their attack became the catalyst for your greatest victory? I'd love to hear your stories of turning betrayal into triumph in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more stories of justice and redemption, and share it with anyone who needs a reminder that sometimes the people who try to destroy us end up giving us the power to build something better. Thank you for listening to David Morrison's story, and remember, never let anyone convince you that you don't deserve justice, respect, and the chance to fight for what's right.